Quick demo of this video. In this ASP.NET Core MVC tutorial, we will implement jQuery Ajax CRUD operations using Modal Popup Dialog. Nowadays, these types of user interface are widely used in big enterprise applications because user can perform all of the operations related to an entity without reloading the page. I am sure you will find this tutorial worthy if you are working with ASP.NET Core MVC. So please watch till the end of this tutorial. You could find same topic discussed in our website CodAffection.com. I have given the link in video description. You can grab code from there as well. Before getting started with this topic, I would like to thank for your PayPal donations for my previous works. In order to make more helpful and quality tutorials like this, you can also support me through PayPal donation. I have given the link in video description and inside the first comment of the video. Without further ado, let's get started with the topic. First of all, we have to create an ASP.NET Core MVC application. For that, here is my Visual Studio 2019. So let's create a project. Select ASP.NET Core Web Application. Click on Next. Name your project. It would be something jQuery Ajax in ASP.NET Core. Then select the location where you want to save this project. Now create the project. From this first drop down, you have to select .NET Core, and inside the second drop down, you have to select the latest ASP.NET Core version. Now select MVC template here. For now, I will uncheck this HTTPS configuration here. Click on create. So here we have the brand new ASP.NET Core MVC application. In order to demonstrate jQuery Ajax CRUD with Modal Popup with an example of bank transaction that we often do with mobile apps or through the bank website itself. So first of all, let's create the model for the transaction. For that, first of all, we have to install a NuGet packages for Entity Framework Core. So right click on this project here, then click on Manage NuGet Packages. Inside this Browse tab here, search for Microsoft Entity Framework. First of all, we have to install this main package here. Select the same version as that of ASP.NET Core to avoid conflicts. You can check its version inside dependencies here under frameworks. Right click, then properties. So here we have 3.1.2. So select the same version here. Click on install. Inside this application, we will be using SQL Server for database. So select this Entity Framework Core SQL Server and select the same version as that of ASP.NET Core. Click on install. Now let's add support for migration command inside Package Manager console. For that, we have to install this package Entity Framework Core Tools. Select the appropriate version. Click on install. So here we have completed with installation of NuGet packages. Now back to the application here. Now let's define a model for transaction. So right click on models folder here, add class transaction model. Now let's define model properties here. Transaction ID, account number, beneficiary name, bank name, then a property for Swift code or IFSC code, and finally amount. This transaction ID will be the primary key for the table, so let's decorate that with key. Now let's add corresponding namespace. For that, you can use the shortcut, hold Ctrl, then press PD. Now select the corresponding using statement. For rest of the properties here, let's specify column data type in SQL Server. For that, we can use this attribute column. Let's add corresponding namespace. Type name is equal to nvarchar 12. Now let's do the same for rest of the properties here. So here we have defined the model. Now let's define corresponding DB context class. For that, let's add another class here, transaction DB context. Now we have to inherit this class from Entity Framework base class DB context. First of all, let's add the constructor. For this constructor, we have a single parameter DB context options of the type transaction DB context as options. Now let's pass the same options parameter to the base class. In order to add a physical table inside SQL Server corresponding to this model here, we have to have a reference to this class transaction model inside the DB context here. So let's add a DB set properties for the model. DB set of the type transaction model as transactions. Now let's inject this DB context class transaction DB context inside the startup class here. If you don't know how this dependency injection works, I will explain once we create an MVC controller. For now, inside this configuration services here, we can inject the DB context like this. Services.add DB context of the type transaction DB context. Let's add the corresponding namespace. During dependency injection, we are trying to create an instance of this class transaction DB context. So in order to create the instance, we have to pass values for this constructor parameters DB context options. Into this parameter, we have to pass information like which database we are going to use, whether it is SQL Server, MySQL, PostgreSQL, etc. In this application, we'll be using SQL Server. Along with that, we have to pass corresponding DB connection string. For that, we can add this lambda expression with options. Since we are using SQL Server, we can call useSQL from these options. So options dot use SQL Server. Let's add corresponding namespace. Now inside this function call, we have to pass the connection string. First, therefore, we will save the connection string inside app settings.json here. For that, we can add this property connection strings. Inside that, I will save a DB connection with this name dev connection. Like this, you can have any number of connections. For now, we have only one connection for development environment. For now, I will just paste the connection string right away. First of all, we have to provide the SQL Server instance, and then we have to provide the database name. It would be something jQuery Ajax MVC DB. We will be using Windows authentication mode inside the app. In order to execute multiple queries in a single batch, we can set this property multiple active result sets. In order to access the saved information inside this app settings.json here, we can make use of this property configuration of the type iConfiguration. So we can do this configuration dot get connection string function can be called. Inside that, we have to pass the connection name, which is dev connection. So far we have completed with entity framework model. Now let's do the migration for creating actual physical DB. For that, select the project from Solution Explorer, then go to Tools, and you get Package Manager, then Package Manager Console. First of all, we have to create a migration. So add migration. Now we have to provide a name for this migration, initial create. Hit enter. As a result of the command execution, here we have the migrations folder with corresponding C# files. Now let's create the actual physical DB. For that, we have to execute this update database. Hit enter. After successful migration, let's check whether we have created the DB inside the SQL Server. So here is my management studio. Let's refresh this databases node here. So here we have the new DB jQuery Ajax MVC DB. Let's expand this. It should have the table for transaction. So here it is. Now let's check its design. So here we have the primary key transaction ID, and rest of the columns are created as per the model. Now if you check this transaction ID column property here, you should see this property identity specification as set here. That means we don't have to insert values into this column ID. SQL Server will take care of that. It will start from 1 and incremented by 1 upon new record insertion. So that's all about the DB part. Now back to the application. Let's create an MVC controller for transaction. So right click on controllers here, add controller, then select this option MVC controller with views using entity framework. Click on add. Model class will be transaction model. transaction DB context. I will name this controller as transaction controller. Click on add. So here we have successfully created the transaction controller with scaffolding mechanism. Now let's run this application. For that, go to debug, then click on start without debugging. So this is how the first ASP.NET Core MVC application looks like. Using default route, it loads this home controller here. It is mentioned inside this startup class here. Home will be the default controller and default action will be index. If you want to access the transaction controller, you just need to do this /transaction. By default, it shows the index action from transaction controller. Now let's update this default controller to transaction. Save this and build this project. For that, go to build, then build solution, or you can use the shortcut Ctrl+Shift+B. Now let's try to access the default route here. You should see the same transaction index action here. That's it. Now back to the transaction controller here. First of all, inside this controller, I want to talk about this constructor here. It has a single parameter of the type transaction DB context as context. Its value is assigned to this private property _context. Rest of the action methods inside this controller will make use of this property to interact with the DB. Value of this context will be passed from dependency injection, as we have seen inside this startup class here. We have called this function addDBContext. So this is how dependency injection works. If there is a controller with constructor parameter of the type transaction DB context, its value will be passed from the dependency injection here. We don't have to create a separate instance in each of the controllers. Hope you understood how dependency injection works in ASP.NET Core. Inside this index action, we are trying to retrieve all of the records from our SQL Server table transactions. With this details action, we are trying to display details of a given transaction. In this application, we don't need this action method, so let me remove that from here. And then here we have get action method and post action method for create. With this create action, we will return a form to insert a new record, and inside this post action method here, we will handle form submit event. Similarly, we have get and post action method for edit also. It is just to update a given record. And finally, here we have get and post action method for delete operation also. We will discuss each of them later in this tutorial. You can see corresponding action method views inside this views folder here under this folder transactions. We have already removed details action method. We don't need that inside this application. So let's remove corresponding view file also. From this index action of the type get, it will return all of the records that we have inside our transaction table. And it is displayed inside this table here. You could see the same table here. Since we have not specified any layout inside this index view here, it will be using default layout page _layout.cshtml from this shared folder here. Basically, it contains the HTML wrapper for rest of the views inside the application. First of all, you could see the HTML declaration here, followed by the head and body tag. Here we have the navigation menu, which is responsible for this top menu here. Along with that, you could see this footer here. In between that, MVC controller views will be rendered in place of this render body function here. By default, MVC uses Bootstrap to style its HTML elements, and hence you can see the same reference for style sheet, and you can see the corresponding JavaScript file here. You can see such static files inside this file here, CSS folder and JavaScript folder here, and rest of the libraries like jQuery and Bootstrap is listed inside this folder here. Inside this application, we have this global CSS file site.css, which is added here. And here we have the global JavaScript file site.js. Its reference is added here. As you might have seen in my previous tutorials, I'm a big fan of Google font Roboto. So let's grab the corresponding style sheet reference and let's use the font inside this application also. So go to this Google font website here, Google font Roboto. And here you can see the different styles of the same font Roboto. So select the styles that you want to add inside your application. And from this embed tab here, you can grab this link reference and let's paste that inside this head tag here. Now let's apply this font inside our application. For that, let me copy this CSS rule and then we can add that inside this site.css body tag. So here it is. For this application, we also need font awesome icons. So let's grab corresponding CDN reference also. Often I grab CDN reference from this website cdnjs.com. From this CSS reference, let's grab this all.min.css. Let's add the reference here. So here we have done with the main layout page. Now let's customize this application for jQuery Ajax CRUD operations. First of all, let's change this h1 tag here, transaction history. In order to sender this text, we can add this class from Bootstrap, text sender. Now let me add a font awesome icon also. Fast for comment $. And let's set the text color with this class text success. Let me save this, reload this page. Inside this table, we have to list all of the transactions from the table. Oh no, we forgot to add the date column for transaction date, which is one of the important information regarding a transaction. So let me show you how you can modify this model for adding new column date. Date time. Date. Now here we have the package manager console. You can access previous commands using upward or downward arrow like this. So first of all, we have to execute this command. I will name this migration as added date column. Hit enter. After that, you have to execute this update database command. Now let's look whether we have created the new column for date. Right click, select top 1000 rows. So here we have the newly added column for date. Now back to the application. Let's update this index view here. We want to show date of transaction inside this table. We don't need this bank name and Swift code inside the table. So let me remove that. Instead of bank name, we can show date. Now let's do the same inside this table body here. Now currently you can see this create new hyperlink here. Let me move that into this last header column here. Currently it is empty. So let me move this hyperlink into this table header here. New transaction. And for this hyperlink, I will be adding this font awesome icon. Class is equal to fast then for -random. Now let me add Bootstrap button classes here. btn hyphen success. And now let's update the text color to white. Now reload this. Now let's look how to make a new transaction. For that, we can try this hyperlink here. So basically it accesses this get action method create here. Okay, and corresponding view is here create. When we submit this form here, it will reach up to this post action method create. And for update operation, these two action methods will be consumed. Edit with get and post. In this application, we are going to combine these create and edit operation into one action method, add or edit. It would be really helpful in a practical application because both of these forms has same form controls. Except this one difference, inside this edit action method, we have this extra input hidden field for transaction ID. If you keep these views create and edit separately in two files, if there is a change inside the form, you have to make the change inside these two forms. So it would be really annoying when it comes to a big application where we have to make the same change in different files. So let's combine this create and edit form into one. For that, I will be renaming this view here to add or edit. we have added date column into the model property after creating this transaction controller and its views. So we have to add corresponding input control for date here. Inside date column, we have to save the transaction date. So which is not an information from user perspective. We will be doing that with the datetime.now property. So I will be adding an input hidden field for date also. So let me copy this transaction ID hidden field and let's paste that below. This is for date. Now let me save this back to the controller here. Now we have to add get and post action method for this add or edit view. For that, let's modify this action method here, add or edit. For this action method, we have a single parameter ID. By default, its value is 0. Inside this action method, based on value of this ID property, we can decide whether we have insert or update operation. If its value is 0, we can say that it is an insert operation. And inside the else part, we have to return the view for edit operation. So I will copy the corresponding code from this existing edit get action method here. Let me copy this and pasting here. Since we have a white keyword here, we have to add async here, and then we have to wrap this result or response with task. So this action method can be used to display a form for insert and update operation. For insert operation, we have to make the get request like this, add or edit. For update operation, we just need to provide the corresponding record ID here, like something 5. Now back to the index view here, let's update this action name to add or edit. Rebuild this project. For that, you can use the shortcut Ctrl+Shift+B. Click on this back to list hyperlink here, so it will navigate the index action of the transaction. Now click on new transaction. So here we have the view from add or edit view. Now let's update this form as per our requirement. First of all, let me remove this heading part here. Let's expand this grid to 12 columns from Bootstrap. I want to display this beneficiary name and bank name controls in same row. For that, we can do this. Class is equal to row, and then we have div call md6. So here we have the one half. Now let's add the other half here. Now inside these columns, we can display beneficiary and bank name. We also have to show this Swift code and amount in a single row. So let me copy this and pasting here for Swift code and amount. Now let's move these divs to these columns here. I want to show phone awesome icons inside these controls, account number and amount. So let's do that here. Div class is equal to input group. Inside that, we need another class with input group prepend, and then we have the div with the class input group text. Here we just need to show this pound symbol. Now let's move this input control for account number into this input group div here. Now we have to do the same for amount control also. So let me copy this and pasting here for amount. Now let's update accordingly. First of all, as an icon, I want to show a phone awesome icon for $. So class is equal to fast then far hyphen $sign. Instead of account number, here we have amount. Let me remove this input control here. Back to the application, reload this view here. Boom, that's it. Don't worry about the width of this form here. We will be showing this form inside a modal pop-up dialog. Now we have to make few more changes inside this view. Before that, let me add few custom CSS inside this site.css here. These are the CSS rules for this entire application. We will be mentioning these in various stages of the app development. Okay. Now we have to enlarge this submit button. So we can add this Bootstrap class here for this button btn block. And we can remove this back to list hyperlink here. Back to the application, reload this view here. I know these input controls are stretched, Once we show them in pop-up dialog, it would be perfectly all right. Now you should know the caching feature inside browsers. Static files inside a web application like style sheet and JavaScript files are cached inside the browsers. Once we access the same page again and again, those static files will be used from the browser cache. Same is happened here. Inside this site.css here, I have changed the border of these input controls from its default Bootstrap size. Now in order to apply the newly added CSS rules into this application here, first of all we have to clear the cache files inside the browser. In Chrome, you just need to use the shortcut Ctrl-H for history, then click on this clear browsing data, select this option cached images and files, then click on clear data. Once it is completed, back to the application, reload this view, boom, that's it. So here we have applied newly added CSS rules. Now back to the index view here. When we click on this new transaction button here, we have to show the same form for add or edit inside a modal pop-up dialog. So let's look how we can do that. So let's look how to open modal pop-up dialog in ASP.NET Core using Bootstrap. First of all, go to the official website getbootstrap.com, click on get started here, search for modal. So inside the application, I'm going to open a modal pop-up dialog like this. Let me copy the corresponding HTML from here, and we can paste the same inside the layout page here underscore layout.cshtml just before this application footer element. Inside this modal pop-up, we don't have to show this pop-up footer here. So let's remove the corresponding modal footer here. Inside this div here, we can render the form HTML dynamically. And inside this modal title, we can show the corresponding modal heading. Okay, now let me add an ID for this div here, form modal. Now, when we click on this new transaction button here, we have to open the modal pop-up. So let's wire up on click event for this button here. Let me remove this ASP action here. Instead of that, we can add this on click event. We'll call this function show in popup. As a first parameter, we have to pass the URL from which we can render the HTML form. As a second parameter, we can pass the title for the model. In case of this new transaction, I will be passing the title as new transaction. Now, as a first parameter, we have to pass the URL for the add or edit action method. For that, we can do this @simple URL.action function can be called. As a first parameter, we have to pass the action method add or edit, and then controller name, which is transaction. And then we have to pass the parameter to this action method add or edit. In case of new transaction, we don't have to pass values for this ID parameter here. By default, its value is 0. So I will pass null here. After all, we have to pass this protocol context.request.scheme. We have passed this last parameter to append the base URL of the app. Now let's define this function show in popup. That we can do inside this global script file here, site.js. So let's define the function here. For this function, we have two parameters, URL and the title. From this function, we have to make jQuery Ajax get request to this add or edit action method here. For that, we can call this Ajax method here. Into the function, we have to pass the configurations. First of all, we are going to make a get request. So type is equal to get, then URL, and we can pass from this parameter itself URL. And now here we have the success callback function with a single parameter response. With this get request, this action method add or edit will return a form. And we have to render that HTML inside this modal pop-up body div here. For that, we can do this. First of all, we have the model inside the div with the ID form model. So form model Inside that we have another div with the class model-body. Now let's render the response inside the div here. So we can call this function HTML with the response. Like this, let's update the model title also. For that, let me copy this and pasting below. Instead of model body, we have model title. Here we can pass the function parameter title. Finally, in order to open Modal Popup Dialog, we just need to call the model function from Bootstrap. For that, let me copy this and pasting below that. We have to call that from this form model, and we can call the function model with this parameter show. Let me save this and back to this application here, reload this page. Let's try this new transaction button here. Boom, that's it. But along with this add or edit form, it also shows this main layout page containing the navigation menu and the footer here. In order to avoid that, we can set this layout as null here. Back to the application, reload this, try this button again. That's it. As you can see here, these labels are showing as exactly as per the model properties. Instead of that, we want to provide a separate display name to separate these words account and number with a space. So back to the application, inside this transaction model, display name, let's add the corresponding namespace, account number. Now let me copy paste for rest of the properties here. In order to submit these forms, all of these input controls are mandatory. So let's add required attribute for these input controls. Required. Inside that we can specify the error message. This field is required. Let me copy paste this same attribute for rest of the properties. Now I want to limit number of characters inside this account number and this Swift code here. For that, we can add this attribute max length up to 12 characters for this account number, and that of Swift code will be 11. Now I want to change this button text here. So back to this add or edit view here. Instead of save, we need submit. Build this project, reload this page. So here we have the form. Now let's define a post action method to handle this form submission. Inside this transaction controller, we have combined get action method for create and update operation into this action method add or edit. Based on this ID value, we can decide whether we have an insert or update operation here. Actually, in case of insert operation, we have to pass an fresh instance of the model transaction model here. Like we have done with this get action method, let's create a post action method for add or edit. For that, I will be modifying this edit post action method here. I want to rename this into add or edit. In order to access this action method, we have to use this URL transaction/add or edit. Inside this action parameter bind properties, we also have to add this property date. We forgot to add this property during creation of the controller. That's why we have to add this property separately. First of all, you can see this comparison between ID property and the transaction ID inside the model. We don't need this comparison. So let me remove that from here. And with this if statement, we will check whether we have any validation error. If there is no error, we can go for insert or update operation. Like we have done inside the get action method, we will check the ID here. If ID is equal to 0, we can do the insert operation. Otherwise, we will do the update operation. Now let's copy paste the code for insert operation from post create action method here. Now let's move these lines for update operation into this else block here. We will submit this form using jQuery Ajax post request. So it would be better if we return the response in JSON format here. Instead of this redirect to action, we can call this function JSON. Inside that we have this new object. Inside that I will set this property is valid as true. And here we have the HTML property. After either of these insert or update operation, we have to pass HTML for this updated table here. Okay, so we will be passing corresponding table HTML as a string inside this property here. If there is any validation error, we have to return the same add or edit view with the form showing error messages. For that, let me copy this same JSON here and pasting here. Is valid will be false. Now let's pass corresponding form or table string inside this property here. As of now, inside ASP.NET Core, there is no such default function. So I'm gonna create a new class helper. Add class helper. For now, I will just paste the function here, render razor view to string. Now let's add missing namespace here. Now let's call this function for passing this HTML string here. Helper render razor view to string function can be called. As a first parameter, we have to pass this controller and then name of the action. Here we have to pass list of updated transactions, which is there inside the index view, so we can pass index here. As a next parameter, we have to pass the model, which is the updated list of transactions that we can retrieve like this underscore context transactions dot to list function can be called. Now let me copy this and pasting here. If there is any validation error, we are going to return the same view add or edit. As a third parameter, we can pass transaction model here. It contains all of the error messages and thereby return form will be highlighted with validation errors. As we have discussed, we are returning this index view here just to show the updated list of tables inside this index view here. But we have to do that in a better way. Inside this transaction controller, by default, we are showing this index action. In a practical application, along with this list of transactions, there might have reports or graphs, etc. So instead of replacing index view elements after insert, update or delete operation, we just need to replace this table here. So it would be better to move this table into a separate partial view like that. For various elements like graphs or reports inside this index view, we might have separate partial views so that we can update them separately without affecting other elements. In order to do that, I'm going to create a separate partial view here. Right click, then add view. I will name this view as underscore view all. Check this option, create as partial view. Click on add. Now let me cut this table from this index view here and pasting inside this partial view here. We also need to copy this model declaration here and let's paste that here. Now let's render this table inside a div. So div id is equal to view hyphen all. Inside this div, let's display this partial view. Avoid HTML dot partial async can be called. As a first parameter, we have to pass the name of the view underscore view all. As a second parameter, we have to pass the value for this model here that I can pass from here model. So instead of returning this index view here, we can return the partial view underscore view all. For this view also, we have to return a list of transactions that can be retrieved from this code here. So here we have done with HTTP post add or edit action method. Now let's remove unwanted action method here. We can remove this edit get action method, create post action method, And here we have get and post action method for delete. We can discuss that later. Now let's look how to submit this form using jQuery Ajax post method. So back to this add or edit view here. Since we are going to submit this form into this post action method add or edit, we have to update this action here. Now let's pass value for this ID parameter. ASP route -id is equal to, we can pass that from the model, so model dot transaction ID. Now let's define the submit event. On submit, we will call this function jQuery Ajax post. As a parameter, we can pass this form itself. In order to prevent default form submit event, from this function we can return false, and we can return the same here also, just to prevent the event. Now let's define this function inside this global JavaScript file site.js. So here is the function with single parameter form. First of all, inside this function I will return false here, just to prevent the default form submit event. To prevent form submit event. Now let me add a try catch block here, and inside this catch block I will just log the error console.log e. Now let's make the jQuery Ajax post request here. For that, we just need to call this Ajax function like we have done for get request. So here we have the options object. First of all, type is equal to post. Now we have to pass the URL for the post action method that we can access from this form object here. So form dot action. After that, we have to pass the data from this form controls. For that, we can make an instance of this form data here. Into this, we just need to pass this parameter form. Now let's reset this property content type as false, and then process data as false. Now we can define the success callback. It is a function with single parameter response. Like that, we can have a callback function to handle the error response. Function with a single parameter error. Inside that, we will just print the error message. Now inside this success function, first of all, we will check whether validation is successful or not. For that, we can check this property is valid. If there is any error message, we just need to update the model body with the add or edit form that is returned from this return statement here. For that, let me copy this statement from here and let's paste that here. And here we have to pass response.html. If this operation is successful, first of all, we have to update this div here. Inside that, we have listed all of the transactions. We will replace that with the new HTML returned from the post action method here. For that, let me copy this statement from here. I will paste that here. This time we have to replace the code inside the div view all, view-all, which is this div here. After all, we just need to hide the modal pop-up dialog. So let me copy this and pasting here. Into this function, we just need to pass this parameter hide. Before hiding this pop-up dialog, we can clear these model body and model title. So let me copy this and pasting here. Let's clear that with an empty string. Finally, inside this form, I want to prevent autocomplete from previously posted data. For that, I will set autocomplete as off. Okay, now let's build this project. Back to the application, reload this page. Now let's create a new transaction. Click on this new transaction button here. Now let's submit this fresh form to check whether validation is working or not. Boom, that's it. So validation is working as we have defined. Now let's populate this form. Account number, beneficiary name would be something Ashton Cox, bank name, something JP Morgan Chase, Swift code, $750. Submit the form. Boom. That's it. So here we have the newly inserted record. You can check the same inside this SQL Server table. Let's execute the select statement again. So here is the record for Ashton Cox bank transaction. During insert operation, we forgot to save the transaction date inside this date property. Let's do that inside this post, add or edit here. Transaction model dot date is equal to date time dot now. Now let's look how to format this date string here. For that we can update this transaction model. We just need to add this attribute display format data format string is equal to. So here we have the format mm/dd/year. Now let's build this project, reload this page. That's it. Now let's update these hyperlinks here. For that, open view all. We don't need this details hyperlink. Let's remove that. For edit operation, I will be copying this hyperlink for new transaction button here, and I will paste that here. Button text will be edit. Let's update this font over some icon to pencil alt. For this button also, we have added this on click event. It will call this function show in popup. It will call the same action method add or edit. Based on the value of ID, it will decide whether we have an insert or update operation. In case of this edit operation, we have to open that form populated with the corresponding record details for update operation. So here we have to pass value for this ID with the selected record ID. So we can pass this new object here. ID is equal to item dot transaction ID. As a second parameter, we have to pass title for the modal popup. It would be update transaction. Back to the application, reload this view. Let's change this button background color. So btn info. So when we click on this edit button, it will call the same function that we have defined for new transaction here. It will make the GET request with the provided URL, and finally it will open the model with the corresponding response HTML. Let's try this edit operation here. So here we have the form populated with corresponding transaction details. This form submit event also is handled inside this add or edit post action method here. Based on the value of ID, we can decide whether we have an insert or update operation. We already executed this insert operation. In case of this current update operation, it will execute this else block here. In order to ensure update operation is working for all of these input fields here, for input fields with the numbers, I will update its last digits to 000, and input fields with the string, I will update that with asterisk marks like this. Submit the form. Update operation is working all of these fields here. This transaction date is saved during insert operation. It won't be changed during update operation. In a practical application, we can't update a previous bank transaction. It's not logical. We are doing this for demonstration purpose only. Now let's look how to implement our final CRUD operation delete here. So back to the partial view all here. In a default MVC application, there are two action methods for delete operation. This GET request will return a view to confirm the operation, and here we have the POST request. We don't need this GET action method for delete operation, so let me remove that from here. Inside this view all here, we are trying to make a GET request. As per the best practice, it is always recommended to implement delete operation with the POST action method. So instead of this anchor link here, we have to show a form with a submit button. So here we have the form. ASP action is equal to delete. Here we are going to make a post request into this action method here. So we also need to pass values for this ID parameter here. So we can do that here. ASP route ID is equal to @item.transaction ID. Now let's add on submit event here. On submit, like we have done for add or edit form. We can call this function jQuery Ajax delete. Into the function, we just need to return this form object itself. Inside this form, we just need to show a submit button for delete operation. Input type is equal to submit, button text will be delete. And now let's apply the Bootstrap class here, btn, then btn-danger. Let me build this project, reload this page. In order to show this button in a single line, we have to add this class for this form here. So class is equal to d inline. Reload this page. Now let's define this function jQuery Ajax delete. Let me open this JavaScript file and let's define the function here. It is a function with single parameter form. Since delete is a loss of data, we have to confirm the operation. So we can call this function confirm here. Are you sure to delete this record? If user confirm this operation, then we will make the post request here. So first of all, we have the try catch block here, console.log e. Now let's make the post request here. Ajax function can be called. For this request, you can copy this post request for the add or edit form here. And let's paste that here. Post request action URL can be accessed from this form action attribute. Inside the form, we don't have any input controls, so we can remove these properties from here. Inside the success function, we just need to update this view all div with the HTML response property. Inside this delete post action method here, we have to return a JSON like we have done inside this add or edit here. Let me copy this and pasting here. We don't need this isValid property here. This HTML string is replaced inside the div here with the ID view all. Finally, inside this function also, in order to prevent the default form submit event, we have to return false. So let me paste that here. Let's build this project, reload this page. Let's create a new transaction. Submit the record. So here we have the new record for Fiona Green. Now let me try to delete this previous record here. Are you sure to delete this record? Confirm the operation. Something went wrong. Let's check that here. Inside this console window here we have the error. The server responded with the status 400. Let's check that here. Yes, it is because of this anti-forgery token. It is a security feature in web applications while submitting a form. I can explain how it works. Back to this application here. If you inspect this delete button here, we have displayed this delete button within a form here. Along with this submit button, you can see an input hidden field here. Actually, this is a token which is generated by ASP.NET Core while rendering this form here. Using this token, ASP.NET Core can identify whether this form submission is made from our web application itself or not. Because hackers can make the same post request from their website to this action method here. If someone make a post request into this action method, they can't provide a valid token like we have inside this form here. Since we have this input field here, while making this jQuery Ajax post here, we have to set these properties accordingly. So let me copy this and pasting here. Inside this delete form, we had a hidden field for anti-forgery token, so we have to set these properties. Reload this page. Now let's try to delete this previous record. Confirm the operation. Boom, that's it. So here we have completed with the jQuery Ajax CRUD operations in ASP.NET Core. Now let's do the final touch-up, like we have to show loading speed now while waiting for the server response. First of all, I want to show a notification after insert, update or delete operation. In order to show notification messages, I will be using this JavaScript library notify.js. So go to their official website here, then download this minified JavaScript file. Once you download this file, let's add that into this Solution Explorer here. Let's add corresponding reference inside this default layout page here. Let me copy this site.js reference and pasting below that notify.min.js. Now back to this site.js. After insert or update operation, we have to show the notification. For that, we can do this. Notify function can be called here. As a first parameter, we can pass this message submitted successfully. As a second parameter, we can pass a configuration object. Global position is equal to top center, and let's set this class name as success. Now let me copy this and pasting here for delete operation, deleted successfully. We can test that notification message once we add loading spinner. Now let me show you one thing. When we click on this new transaction here, we are making a GET request to the add or edit view. If you are just typing that direct URL here, transaction/add or edit, you can see the plain HTML here. Inside this application, we have defined this action method add or edit just for jQuery Ajax GET request. We have to prevent these types of direct access. For that, we are going to add a custom attribute inside this helper file here. For now, I will just paste that class outside this helper class here. Let's add corresponding using statement here. So here we have defined this attribute not direct access. Inside this if block, we have two conditions. Whether we are trying to access the corresponding action method directly through URL, or we are trying to access this action method outside this domain. In those two cases, we will redirect the user to the default route. Now let's apply this attribute to the add or edit get action method here. No direct access. Let's build this project. Let's try to make this get request again. That's it. Here we have redirected to the default route. Now let's talk about final bonus point. Let's look how we can show a loading spinner during Ajax operations. For that, first of all, we have to add a div just before this footer inside the default layout page. We have already added CSS rules for styling these divs and for the animation. Let me save this, back to the application, reload this. So this is how the loading spinner looks like. You can see the corresponding loader styles inside this site.css here. Based on your interest, you can have different styles for your loading spinner. Now let's restrict this loading spinner during Ajax operation only. For that, inside this site.js here, we will add a jQuery load event. First of all, we will hide that loader, and when we start the Ajax request, we will show this loader. After completing the request, we will hide that loader. Back to the application, reload this. It is not working. Let's inspect that here. Here we have an error. Let's check that inside this site.js here. This would be working fine. Let's check whether we have any error while adding the notification here. Yes, instead of equal to symbol, we have to use colon. Now let's correct the same mistake here. Save, back to the application, reload this page, boom, that's it. Now when we click on this new transaction button here, it will make the get request. During that time, we can see this loader here. Now let's create a new transaction here. Submit the form. That's it. So here we have the notification message and we already see the loading spinner. Now let's try the update operation. Let me change this amount, submit. That's it. Now let's delete this record. I have also written a blog post on the same topic. You can check the link in video description. You can grab code from there as well. So that's it guys. Here we have completed with jQuery Ajax CRUD operations in ASP.NET Core with the help of Modal Popup Dialog. If you found this video helpful, please thumbs up this video, and for more awesome videos like this, please be subscribed to this channel CodAffection. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can benefit from this. Have a nice day. Bye.